Can folks hear me? Am I coming through clear, loud enough? All right, great. Getting some yeses here in the chat. So great. Well, let's go ahead and get started. So this is State of Water Policy. Let me start a tiny bit about me, your speaker here. So my name's Scott Berry. In my professional life, I'm the Director of Policy and Government Affairs for an organization called the U.S. Water Alliance, which is a national nonprofit that's working to modernize and transform the water sector through collaboration. And I've been in water and infrastructure policy for about my entire career, so about 14, 15 years or so. And I'm also a former debater. I mean, policy debate changed my life. It helped me, be a better thinker and better writer, and really taught me not only to ask questions about how the world worked, but sort of how to ask those questions and who to ask them to. And I debated for 4 years for the University of Mary Washington up in Virginia, starting as a novice in college. And I guess for what it's worth, in my third year, my partner and I sort of qualified for the NDT through our district tournament. After college, I did some coaching and some judging, and Noddle was kind enough to invite me here to sort of share my perspectives with you all as a water policy expert, but also somebody that sort of understands debate. And usually when I give talks like this to audiences around the country, I have to apologize for talking a little bit faster than normal, but this might be the one audience that I have where that's not an issue. So I'm really excited to sort of dive right in. And today we're only going to be really able to scratch the surface of many of the issues in water policy. And my goal here is to at least mention something explaining the major areas in water policy today, to give you kind of a sense of the areas of controversy that I think are ripe for some deeper exploration as part of your school's engagement with next season's topic. And I'm going to start with some basics and then go big with some of the fundamental policy and structural issues in water right now, and then kind of zero in on some of the larger topics to do some sort of slightly deeper dives. And I'm hoping to save a good amount of time for discussion and questions at the end. But if you want me to clarify something I'm talking about, or just sort of repeat something, you can flag me down in the chat. I'm going to try and periodically build some time in to look through the chat and the Q&A function, just so that we can get to questions as they arise. And if you sat in on my Clean Water Act talk this morning, or are coming to my Safe Drinking Water Act talk later today, apologies that there might be a little duplication. But right before we get going with the basics, I would be interested to see if there are particular areas that folks are interested in covering, so we can look at those later on and maybe go a little bit further in depth once I'm kind of done with the broad brush overview. So if you want to put those in the chat, we can return to those later, or you can put them in there as I'm kind of going through the next bat of stuff. All right. So let us begin with the basics. And I apologize if this seems remedial for some folks, but I want to make sure we're all on the same playing field. So in most places in the United States, drinking water is taken from an above ground or underground source. It's treated at a filtration facility, and it's delivered to your home through a series of underground pipes, right? So wastewater from your drains and your toilets is also taken away from your home by a different network of pipes, and it's delivered to a big treatment plant. It's cleaned, and then it's returned to a natural water source like a river. In some places, you also have a network of storm drains that also collect rainwater and deliver it to the same types of treatment as the water that comes from your house, where it too is then returned back to nature. And in each of these cases, drinking water, wastewater, and stormwater, there is an entity called the utility that owns and operates these processes. And in some places, there's a single entity that manages maybe 2 or 3 of those. In other places, you have separate drinking water and wastewater utilities. And each of these entities charges you for the service of having clean drinking water delivered to your home and your wastewater taken away and cleaned. Although it's important that about 25% of the country are not connected to these water and wastewater utility systems. Instead, they get their drinking water from underground wells owned by a homeowner, or their wastewater gets stored and broken down underground in septic tanks that must be periodically emptied and cleaned. So this is tremendously important, because in almost every case, these drinking water wells are the homeowner's responsibility entirely and are unregulated by state and EPA and federal EPA entities. Septic tanks are only regulated insofar as they have to be contained, right? They can't just leak sewage into the ground. And if they do, the owner of the tank is liable for that cleanup. But back on utilities, though, in most cases, utilities are public entities. They're almost always part of a local government. And in some cases, they may be privately owned utilities that are responsible to investors. And about somewhere around maybe 4 to 6% of drinking water utilities are privately owned, and about maybe 1 or 2% of wastewater utilities are privately owned. Some are publicly owned but privately operated. There's like a whole spectrum of ownership from completely public to completely privatized, and you'll find utilities kind of anywhere along that spectrum. The last sort of basic thing to know is that there are long-standing and complex rules and regulations governing both drinking water, which would be the Safe Drinking Water Act, and wastewater, which would be the Clean Water Act. And both of these pieces of legislation are part of the kind of golden age of environmental legislation that rose in the 1970s. So those are the basics. So let's talk about some of the fundamentals. Now we've got basic facts. So they're starting at the very roots of water policy in this country. Water has been treated as a commodity or a service to be performed rather than a basic element that's sort of needed for human survival, and has never really been considered a human right in this country. And this stems from the Constitution itself. So the Constitution was written obviously before our modern understanding of the environment, and the word water actually only appears once in an obscure section about naval prisoners, actually. So it's the only time the word water actually ever appears in the Constitution. And the Constitution, at least in theory, is supposed to be the foundation of all governmental jurisdiction in this country. And it's without explicit grounds to legislate or regulate water, or really anything environmental for that matter. So like the Clean Air Act, the Endangered Species Act, and all like the other kind of big signpost environmental laws all have this sort of same problem. But the Constitution does grant some pretty explicit authority to Congress to regulate commerce. So the only way to be able to regulate things like water or other kind of environmental things is to say, well, water affects commerce, therefore we have jurisdiction to write legislation governing it. But placing environmental laws under the commerce law means that we necessarily only find connections to the environment, in this case water, insofar as it relates to economic activities. It's treating water as a commodity. So for the more like critique-minded folks in the room, there's your link, right? Like water is commodified in the United States for this specific reason. And this, of course, has led to some fundamentally inequitable outcomes around things like water access, around environmental justice, and water affordability, all of which I'm going to try and cover a little bit later on. But this is a fundamental constitutional issue around water that isn't going to change in the status quo without changing the Constitution. Second fundamental issue I want to cover is the legislative and regulatory siloing of clean water and drinking water. I mentioned before that these sort of two types of water are kind of covered by the Safe Drinking Water Act and the Clean Water Act, and they both had their roots in the 1970s. So the Clean Water Act was last updated in 1987, and the Safe Drinking Water Act last updated in 1996. And we've learned a lot about how the environment works, even since the original Clean Water Act and Safe Drinking Water Act in the 1970s, but even since, the 80s and 90s, especially around how all water is connected in larger systems and watersheds, and how changes in drinking water can affect wastewater and vice versa. We had a conversation about this in my Clean Water Act session. So let me give you an example. So one of the ways that we guard against like lead that might be in water pipes is to alter your drinking water chemistry slightly to include more phosphates in your water. No effect on you as a person, they pass through your system, but now the water coming down the wastewater stream has increased phosphates in it, which is in violation of the Clean Water Act. So to be in compliance with the Safe Drinking Water Act, you now have to add more capacity to your wastewater facility to clean something out of the wastewater so that you can stay in compliance with the Clean Water Act. So it's sort of like how those two provisions don't really talk to one another because they're very separate legally speaking. Another example is that, like at EPA, for drinking water and wastewater are regulated under two separate offices, two completely different jurisdictions. And even in the House of Representatives, there's two totally different committees that have jurisdiction over water, one on wastewater operations and one on drinking water operations. So this whole like modern, like the separation of the two sort of statutory and regulatory structures prevents a lot of modern kind of holistic thinking and action about water as a system. Another big kind of fundamental challenge for water progress is the system of water rights that exists in this country. Now, admittedly, this can be more important in some regions of the US than others. And typically you see this as a much deeper issue in like drier states west of the Mississippi River. But even very recently, you've seen conflicts over water rights between states like Georgia and Florida, both of which we consider water-rich states. And these conflicts went all the way to the Supreme Court. And it was like a very recent Supreme Court decision about Georgia and Florida. And I will also admit that I know less about like this sort of like Western water law than I do about a lot of other water issues. It's sort of its own body of literature and study, and I don't have a deep background there. But one thing I do want to make very clear about this is that this system of water laws and rights specifically shortchanges tribal communities. Many have been fighting for decades or centuries even to secure water supplies for their people and for the right to protect those supplies from things like fast-growing cities or direct threats to the supply like oil pipelines. And the progress on that has been really slow. The last sort of fundamental issue I want to cover is what's called system fragmentation. Most major utilities like natural gas, electricity, internet, TV, cell phones, they cover large swaths of customers over many different geographic areas. And let's take a look at a series of maps that were put together by one of my member utilities to help folks kind of understand what I'm about to explain to you. So take a look at this map of natural gas utilities across the lower 48 states. You see them spread out. There's maybe about 600 or 700 of these utilities across the country. And then this one is electric utilities. But if you remember what I said about water, almost every water utility is embedded in a local government. And nearly every town or settlement or whatever in America needs water first and foremost to function. So while there may be about 600 or 700 natural gas utilities and maybe about 1,200 electric utilities, there are over 55,000 drinking water utilities across the country. This is an absolute ton of different actors in the water space. Now, imagine trying to spread solutions across so many different actors. And I'll also grapple with this. So like more than 90% of these utilities serve populations of less than 10,000 people, meaning we have an absolute ton of very small utilities out there. And this is really important because of how utilities are funded. Remember we talked a minute ago about how like utilities charge for their service. That's part of the basics. So your house has a water bill that it pays, and that money goes to the utility so that it can pay the people that operate and maintain the utility and continue to build to meet the community's needs. Now, let's say your utility needs a new water treatment facility. Maybe yours is too old and it can't support the new technology that's coming out that the Clean Water Act says that you got to have. So maybe that costs that new plant maybe costs $20 million. And now let's say you live in a big city that's maybe 800,000 people, like Denver or I guess San Francisco is probably about that size. So spreading that 20 million across every one of those households isn't too big of a burden on each individual household. But if you live in a community of 8,000 people, that same 20 million across every household looks really different. And sure, you probably don't need the $20 million plant for the 8,000 people, but it's pretty hard to build a treatment plant these days that is in compliance with regulatory needs that doesn't fall into the about $10 or $15 million range. So there's a lot of expensive infrastructure, and that burden is being shifted onto a lot of smaller utilities that are having a harder and harder time to pay. So the fragmentation of our water systems means that solutions are harder to spread across the many actors in the water sector. And it also means there's a tremendous disparity in the resources available to each individual actor in the water sector. And it also makes enforcement more difficult when you have tens of thousands of different entities whose behavior you need to be tracking on a constant basis. So we've started to sort of scratch the surface of this sort of issue of funding. Like a lot of other policy issues, the lack of funding remains the single largest barrier to progress on a range of different issues. And so whether it's infrastructure or climate resiliency or affordability or flooding or droughts or whatever, the solution to every water problem runs into the problem of how much that solution costs and who pays for it. So let's talk about what the need out there is. The collective need for water infrastructure investment out there has been measured by a lot of different entities. You probably every couple of, at least once a year or something, you see a new entity's got some new study about what the need for water infrastructure out there. So that number usually ends up being somewhere around 600 billion to $1 trillion backlog of needed water infrastructure projects that exist out there just for water. So given that tremendous need, how are we doing to address this huge backlog? And working in concert with the American Society of Civil Engineers, so my organization kind of measured the gap in what we are collectively spending on water infrastructure and what we need to be spending on water infrastructure just to keep pace with replacement and rehabilitation needs. And in 2019, that gap was $81 billion a year and growing. And if that trend continues, we projected that gap to increase to 136 billion in just 20 years. And collectively, that means over the next 20 years, we will have spent $2.2 trillion less than we need to just keep pace, right? Not even counting about preparing those systems for things like future pandemics or future climate conditions, just keeping pace. So we're not doing so hot in terms of that, and the current trends are not especially optimistic. So where is that funding burden falling? So who's paying for the water infrastructure? Well, I can tell you it's not the federal government, which spends just about $2.5 billion, B with a billion, on a year on water funding. As a percentage of all of the spending, the feds have kicked in less and less. 40 years ago, during the kind of like height of the post-Clean Water Act era, they were picking up the tab for almost about a third of water projects. You can see that here. The pink, I think that's pink. I'm not really great with colors, but the pink area is the amount of like the share that's taken up by the federal government. Now it's about 4%. So this has shifted the burden of funding water almost entirely onto state and local governments. And really that just means local governments. And that means your water bills represent a bigger and bigger chunk of the utilities budget, which makes what they charge you for water incredibly important to them. And even small changes one way or another have big impacts on their bottom line and on their operating budgets. So last point I want to make about funding, as you can see here, if you compare water infrastructure funding, which again is the pink line, to other infrastructure categories like highways or aviation, which are the blue and green lines, over the last 40 years or so, the proportion of the water tab that's picked up by the feds has continued to fall, while other categories have remained relatively stable. That's kind of the funding thing. I'm going to pause briefly there. Yeah, Ruby, some of these maps are from 2017 because some of these numbers are, that's the most recent numbers we have for CBO, and some of that last one is from 2017. That's from a little bit of an older study, and you can find, I really like the one with the lines that kind of talk about the federal share, but that federal share has not increased since 2017 either. And in fact, it's remained probably around 4%. So just to clarify. But there's a more recent study that covers this. That was the one with the American Society of Civil Engineers that I talked about. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I know. I can't really control how big the slide is on the screen, but I'll try and continue to explain what's in the images. All right. Okay, so that is the funding challenge. Those are the big fundamental and kind of structural barriers to progress that I wanted to cover. So let's look a bit deeper at some of the impact areas that I think will be coming up in a water protection topic. And I want to hit water quality first. So when I say water quality, I'm talking about the contents of your water. Does it contain too high levels of X or Y? And these levels are set and enforced by the Environmental Protection Agency and the states. And for a little bit more on how that process works, if you have a chance to look at some of the videos of these after the fact, go take a look at my Clean Water Act history conversation that happened earlier today. There's a pretty good conversation around how that worked. Now, there's a lot of different kind of contaminants that need to be cleaned out of drinking water before they get to your home, or out of wastewater before it's returned to the environment. And when I say cleaned out of, I don't necessarily mean eliminated completely. I mean that they appear below the maximum levels allowed by law. So these contaminants can be physical. So these are things like sediments and organic material. They can be chemical. So that would be like fertilizers or pesticides, salts, and heavy metals, not the fun kind. And they could be biological. So that would be like microbes, bacterias, viruses, parasites, all that jazz. And then they can also be radiological. So that would be like uranium, plutonium, and these things can also be in your water. And we also talk about these things in terms of legacy contaminants, which are ones that we've known are dangerous for a while, and we have a long regulatory history with. And then we have emerging contaminants, which are the ones that we're just sort of finding out about now, or that have been on the scene. We've been able to detect them fairly recently. We may not yet know if they're dangerous, or if we believe they're dangerous, we may not know what levels are safe in our water. And they may not even be regulated yet. There's a lot of emerging contaminants, like one of the ones we're going to talk about called PFAS, that are not technically regulated by the federal government, and they're just sort of like left up to either local utilities or states to figure out if they want to clean out of the water yet or not. So two big contaminants in the literature right now that are kind of taking up a lot of oxygen in the policy space are lead and PFAS. Lead is a legacy contaminant. We've known about it for a long time. It's been a problem for a long time. You haven't been able to put a new lead line into your service territory since 1986 or 87, 86, I think. But the lead in water is not like from an external source, right? It's not something that's coming into the water. It's actually part of the pipes itself, and the lead kind of leaches out of the pipes and contaminates the water. So the call is sort of coming from inside the house in the water sector sense. You can't put in the lead pipes anymore, like I said, but there are millions of existing lead pipes left in the ground right now. And I could do like a whole hour on lead pipes and lead in water. Suffice to say, it is a deeply complex topic with a lot of relation between what's going on at the federal level, what's going on at the state level, and there's a lot of politics on both sides around how this functions. And there's a ton of material out there on that already. The next one I want to talk about is PFAS, which stands for per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. PFAS, which are a new and emerging contaminant. So they're the chemicals that make things like nonstick, like if you've ever used like a nonstick frying pan, or if you've ever like eaten a fast food burger or something, like they've got that weird kind of like nonstick coating on the inside of food wrappers. They also, it appears in lots and lots, like it's shocking how many kinds of substances have these sorts of chemicals. Firefighting foam is another big one. It's a whole class of chemicals, so it has thousands of different variations, and the science around this is still evolving. And EPA does not regulate this yet, although they have, the Trump administration said they were going to take a pass and said we weren't going to regulate this. The new Biden administration has said that they are going to look at adding this to the kind of like regulatory portfolio. The science we've seen on the two most prevalent PFAS chemicals, which are PFOS and PFOA, the science about those says they can definitely be dangerous and cancer causing. I think they have something to do with like attacking the thyroid or something, but either way. And the other scary thing is that we've not really ever looked for this stuff in the environment, but where we are looking for it, we're finding it everywhere, especially in places with industrial facilities or near military bases, partly because military bases run firefighting drills all the time, and for decades have been using this firefighting foam and then just sort of rinsing it off, and it goes down into the groundwater supply. So near military bases, you see huge concentrations of a lot of these kinds of things. The nature of this chemical, the fact that it's sort of nonstick, means that it's really, really hard to clean out of water. It is also does not degrade over time. It just continues to build up. It's called, there's a word for that, bioaccumulative. So it's going to be a huge deal if we don't start taking care of it now. And like I said, pretty much everywhere we've started to look for this stuff, some states have really have put quite a bit of money, like Michigan, California, Oregon, Washington have really started to put a lot of resources into like looking for this stuff, and like where they're looking, they're finding quite a bit of it. So let us talk about one last water quality issue, which I wanted to cover, is called non-point source pollution. We talked a little bit about this in my Clean Water Act session, but the Clean Water Act is meant to govern discrete sources of pollution in our nation's rivers and streams. You can kind of see that here. Those are called point sources. So that would be like in this, the two at the bottom, sort of like the wastewater treatment plant, the factory. Those are like points that inject, that discharge into a river stream. But this is one of those places where our understanding of the environment and science have outpaced our legislation. It's easy to identify the source of pollution when it's like a pipe discharging in a river, like here, or like a leaking underground storage tank, for example. These are what are called point sources because the source is a single point, right? But we also understand that non-point source pollution exists, and rather than a single point, there are many, many smaller sources that get aggregated, and as they aggregate, they concentrate. So, for example, this would be like maybe like a huge farm that covers hundreds of acres. You can kind of see like there's a cropland example here. On this farm, there's like relatively little fertilizer over the whole surface area of the farm, well within legal limits. But then, you got a big heavy rainstorm, and as it rains over the whole farm, not just over part of it. And that water kind of washes over the farm. And as it does so, it collects more and more of that fertilizer. And eventually that runs into that nearby river. But since the farm borders maybe like a solid mile of that river, there's no single point that's the source of the fertilizer. It's the whole farm. It's that whole hundreds of acres. And maybe together with like neighboring farms all running off into the same river, that means downstream of the farms, the fertilizer concentration is much higher. But again, there's no single source. And even for the farms themselves, they all have legally, fertilizer under the legal limit. So it's much harder to say this is the problem we need to fix with the way that the Clean Water Act is currently written. This most often manifests, as you can probably tell from my example, is with agriculture. But you can see it in runoff from suburban developments and city streets that don't have big systems to collect and treat stormwater. So with that said, this is a huge problem in the United States because agricultural runoff is one of, if not the largest sources of unregulated pollution left in this country. Last time I was looking for this, I think something like 50% of the unregulated pollution left in this country is non-point source pollution, and agriculture is the largest source of non-point source pollution. But the agriculture industry is also crucial to a huge part of our economy and to our food security as a nation, and for a lot of other nations' food security too. And not for nothing, but the farm lobby is one of the most powerful in the country at the federal and state levels. So progress on this non-point source topic has been especially slow as a result. And so the Clean Water Act has been unable to sort of evolve as a result. Does that make sense? I know non-point source stuff can be kind of tough to grapple with, but it seems like let folks know. Let me know in the chat if I need to go back and kind of cover some of that stuff. But seeing none. All right. So let's talk about. We talked about water quality. So let's talk about water quantity. So by which I mean, whether it's too much water like flooding or too little water like droughts. So both of these things are more intense in certain regions, and some of the regions can have both. So you can have droughts followed by flooding because of just the way that soil compacts when it dries out. But there's issues around limited water supplies and who gets access and who has priority are critical parts of this canon of water law, especially in the West. I talked about this a little bit in the beginning. And dealing with urban and rural flooding can be a huge drain on emergency budgets across the country. And this is also a little like where I like to talk about climate change and how it makes every water problem worse. But this sort of like too much, too little problem, especially. The changing climate is making both of these impacts much more intense. So droughts are longer, they're deeper, they're wider, and flooding is more intense. It happens more often, and it affects more places. And now climate policy and water policy are often thought of separately, but they are inextricably bound up. Climate stress is often felt as water stress, if you think about it, right? So like flooding, like if you think about the impacts that we talk about when we talk about, building an impact out of climate change, or as part of a DISAT or something, you've got flooding, you've got more frequent intense storms, you've got sea level rise, you've got drought, you've got decreased snowpack, you've got low river flows. All of these are water issues, and they are impacting communities across our country and will continue to do so as the climate changes. And policies that are designed to adapt or prepare for or prevent these problems, in many cases, are actually water policies. So that's an important note, that climate and water policy are inextricably linked. So the next thing I want to talk about is equity and access and affordability. And every single issue that I've talked about so far is a water equity issue. And water equity issues are also intertwined with climate equity issues. So like, for example, fragmented utilities often leave communities of color worse off than the better resource utilities of their neighboring white communities. Funding often goes to communities with the capacity to go after it, which also leaves many of these communities of color behind. And even within cities that have large, well-resourced utilities, the neighborhoods with the worst problems related to things like aging infrastructure, flooding, or like legacy lead service lines, they are Black and brown neighborhoods. And these neighborhoods are also more likely to experience water shutoffs. And studies about trust in water utilities have consistently shown that people of color trust their water less than their white counterparts, especially after high-profile water crises like what happened in Flint, Michigan. There are also issues around who has access to water. A recent report that was put out by my organization combed through a bunch of available data sources and did some qualitative research to discover what the actual water access gap is. And we found that there are at least 2 million people in this country that just do not have any access to hot and cold running water or even a toilet in their homes. And Black and Latinx people are twice as likely to lack access than white people. And Native Americans are 19 times more likely to lack access. These people are in every state, but there are concentrated pockets all over the country in places like Appalachia, the border colonias, the Navajo Nation, Puerto Rico, and in especially like the deep rural South. I also want to talk about the growing issue around affordability. So we've kind of skirted around this a little bit when we talked about funding, but even before the pandemic and the economic downturn, water rates continue to rise faster than wages, and more people are unable to afford their water bills. And I want to be clear, affordability is not just an issue for poor areas. In virtually every single US community, there are vulnerable populations like your elderly, disabled, low-income residents who struggle to pay their water bills. And many utilities face this and create this catch-22, right? Like they need to raise their water rates in order to pay for the necessary infrastructure, but often their rate base, especially these low-income ratepayers, cannot absorb that additional cost on their water bills. And even small changes in a water bill affect poorest folks harder and affect them first. And because of this commodification of water that we kind of talked about in the beginning, most utilities charge volumetrically, right? Meaning, so it's a fixed price per gallon, just like if you were filling up at a gas pump. So whether you're living on $20,000 a year or whether you're Jeff Bezos, if you have the same utility, you're paying the same water rates. So this is an equal but not equitable system. So contrast that with the idea that, critical as they are, clean, safe, and reliable water and wastewater services are not free. And the average water bill in the US, that's about $73 a month, I think, which is well below your average monthly electric bills, your cable TV bills, and your cell phone bills. And a study conducted by the OECD showed that the US has the lowest burden among developed nations for water and wastewater bills when measured as a percentage of household income. And also, just not for nothing, but utilities have not ever charged the full cost of service to ratepayers, so water continues to be underpriced, just as a result of things like the massive infusion of capital from the Clean Water Act, and the fact that utilities are parts of local governments, and a lot of times mayors just do not want to run in a city where they've increased water rates because it's something that hits everybody and nobody likes it. Nobody likes having to pay a bigger water bill. The key issue here is how to ensure when you're crafting sort of policy conversations around water and funding and all of these other things, the key issue is how to ensure that everyone has access to affordable water and sewer service while also ensuring that water utilities have adequate revenues to cover rising operating costs and to meet the need to invest in aging infrastructure. And the last thing I'll say here is that unlike programs to help people afford things like housing or food or heating in the winter, there is no federal assistance program to help people afford their water bills. All right, so I'm going to close here by talking about the COVID-19 kind of global pandemic and its impact on the water sector. So COVID-19 is really upending life across America, kind of disrupting business as usual, and it's really shifting the way we relate to and work with one another, right? Like in many ways and across many areas of the economy, the pandemic has really exposed and reinforced a lot of the structural challenges and social inequities that exist across everything. In the water sector, this has played out in access to water, in the cost of water services, governance structures, and even how we fund and deliver those critical water services. So think about this. One of our earliest and best tools to combat the spread of the virus was to encourage people to wash their hands frequently, right? But what about those folks that I mentioned, those 2 million folks that just don't have running water? Or maybe you never had it to begin with, or maybe you lost your job so you couldn't afford to pay your water bill anymore, and so your water service got shut off. Or maybe you were reluctant to continue to wash your hands because you knew that the water in your tap contained toxic chemicals, and bottled water was expensive and hard to find during the shortages that were part of the shortages that were part of the early days. But now imagine there was a hospital at its COVID peak. All of a sudden, it couldn't get water because of a burst pipe in the street outside. Water is such a frontline defense in our public health arena that is taken for tremendous granted. Now imagine it's a restaurant already struggling because it can't seat customers. It's barely hanging on because it's been able to get its delivery service out there. It's got to close for a day or two because a pipe burst in the street and the utility is stretched so thin because it's had to distance. It's had to make sure its repair crews socially distanced, and to make sure that the critical staff that are delivering water to people don't get sick. So it's only got a few people that can show up at once. So water is also on the front line of our economy. And just like with climate change, the pandemic is making every single water problem worse. It made every crack and fissure in the water sector much worse and really exposed those deep flaws in a lot of parts of our system. but it's also like, I don't want to make this all about doom and gloom, right? Like has also renewed a lot of hope. Like the attention that the pandemic has brought to issues like water access and water affordability has resulted in new and increased attention by policymakers. And between, the trillions of dollars in COVID relief packages and, potentially trillion more in a big infrastructure package, things are on the table now that never would have been on the table a year ago. The dollar amounts on the table that are on the table now would have been laughable a year ago. So I'm hopeful that we can use this unique political moment to really affect some real change in the water sector, which is why I think it's such an exciting time to be debating this stuff, right? Like I expect there will be some uniqueness issues here because of a lot of the stuff that I've been talking about, but by and large, there are a ton of great controversy areas to delve into on the affirmative and the negative. And so in the interest of trying to get some more conversation about some of this stuff, I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to invite folks to jump into the chat or the Q&A, or turn your cameras on, and we can have kind of a conversation about how this is working.